Welcome to Best Practices in Clinical Care with Asian Americans. My name is Dr. Helen Sue. I use she, her, ta pronouns, and I'm happy to have this talk with you with Agents of Change. And let's discuss some of the best practices for care with Asian Americans and also understand more about who is in this community. My background, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an immigrant from Taiwan of Chinese and Mongolian, Manchurian heritage. I am a past president and fellow of the Asian American Psychological Association, a 50-year-old national org. I'm also the past president of the Asian American Psychological Association, Division 45, which is a society for the study of race, culture, and ethnicity, as well as the founder of Hella Mental Health, a consulting firm for entertainment and corporate as well as educational facilities. And I have had the privilege of doing work with primarily um, Asian American populations for many years now as a specialty. Although even I cannot say that I am the specialist, and I'll talk some more about why when we talk about cultural humility. As we start out, I would recommend taking a moment to reflect what trainings or which readings about Asian American mental health were a part of your clinical training. What would you like to know about mental health in Asian American communities? If you were like me, you probably didn't get a lot of training about Asian American mental health and may find yourself seeing clients and not necessarily having a wealth of readings or knowledge to draw back upon. So, in our time today, objectives include understanding important population traits that are critical for accurate assessment of Asian American clients. Learn some fundamental facts about AA-NHPI mental health, which are relevant to treatment, and that stands for Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander mental health. Learn about best practices for clinical treatment of Asian Americans. And before we finish, I'll identify resources for AA-NHPI mental health and wellness because none of us can be expected to be experts on every type of person or diversity, but we can definitely prepare a list and a resource list and have readings available that can help facilitate and round out the quality of our work. Now, I approach everything as a therapist from perspective of cultural humility. And this is the idea that none of us will ever be competent, period. As if we know everything about a certain type of client or community. But Turvalon and Murray Garcia's work really was about this idea of humility is a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique to redress power imbalances and to develop mutually beneficial and non-paternalistic clinical and advocacy partnerships with communities or clients. And so this is just how our role as therapists is to be a guide and to empower clients and to try to work as ethically as possible, even if we don't know all of the facts or history that might be relevant, but that we're able to learn and to grow along with our clients. And to be aware of things like areas of privilege and bias. And this is how we facilitate growing more and more our own skills. Now, next, we enter just understanding the basics of who are we actually talking about? Who are Asian Americans? Did you know that the first Filipinos arrived in what is now the United States in 1587? We're now talking about a group with dozens of languages among and within us, our group, 24 plus million people within the United States. So in the past, historically, Asian Americans groups tended to identify as I'm Japanese American, I'm Malaysian American, I'm Chinese, I'm Korean. It wasn't until the late 60s that Asian Americans became a political identity and a common term. And what does that mean? It was when all these different groups that had arrived in the US in completely different decades, under completely different circumstances, realized that they did have some cultural aspects in common and that they definitely experienced similar um, political and racial experiences in the United States. And therefore, they became a group that, it sounds redundant to say, but there are no Asian Americans in Asia, right? This is a community that only exists in the United States. It is the fastest growing ethnic group, projected to surpass Latinx and Hispanic communities by 2055. And we may not hear about it, but 13% of the more than 11 million undocumented immigrants within the United States are Asian Americans. I had used the term AANHPI earlier, and I want to mention that Native Hawaiians and Pacifica peoples are a distinct group. I include them because they're often bunched with Asian Americans in the census and in political orgs. We often align together. But I also really want to recognize that this is not an area that I have a lot of expertise, and that I would recommend, if you have an NHPI client, that you can look up experts specific to them. It's really important to know that they are Native Hawaiian, Samoan, and Chamorro, but there are many other groups, and you will find them throughout the United States. And they are about 1.5 million Americans. That you may find yourself with a client who is Tongan or Marshallese, and that is definitely a different experience than, say, Asian Americans who were refugees or immigrants, because NHPI people were occupied people, not refugees or immigrants. So I would recommend looking up experts on that if you have an NHPI client. Now, as for the others grouped into the Asian American category, one important thing to note as you're trying to understand your client is that we are the most bimodal of all groups. And what does bimodal mean? I'm referring to, instead of a normal statistical distribution curve, where most people are kind of in the middle and then there's outliers on either end, in our community as Asian Americans, we're bimodal. It looks statistically like a camel's hump, or with a valley in the middle. That it can be confusing because among Asian Americans, you have the highest levels of household wealth and educational attainment. Yet also, we have in our community those with the lowest levels of educational attainment and the highest levels of poverty. And so, stereotypes like the model minority myth obscure the complexity of these communities and these clients. And when you mash up all our statistics together, you might think or hear that Asian Americans have a normal curve distribution like everybody else, or that we're doing really great. Um, but that's actually not necessarily true. So it's really important to understand that as you're considering and in your assessment of your Asian American client. I like to also go by the rule: make sure you ask how your client identifies themselves. They may say, I just see myself as an American, and you can understand what that means to them. Or common terms I've heard: Asian American, Asian international, for example, international students that are here to study, but mostly grew up in another country. AANHPI, which I've talked about. There's also the acronym APIDA, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, and that emphasizes South Asian identity. Pacifica peoples, third culture, adoptees, and one of the fastest growing groups, Asian Americans of multiple heritage or mixed heritage. You also might be least familiar with the term third culture. Um, Third culture kids, as they often refer to themselves, are someone who, for example, Maybe say they were born in China to Chinese parents, but they were raised in another country like Brazil and they learned the language and grew up there. But then they're now living in a third country like the United States. And so they have a multiple mixed cultural background. Adoptees might be cross racial, transracial, and that brings with it different psychological experiences. And multiple heritage kids, depending on their experiences growing up in their families and communities, might be feeling more in touch or out of touch with different aspects of their heritage and their family. So I always go with the trying to ask folks to describe what do they call themselves as a starting point. One of the reasons that all of us who are licensed therapists have received so little training about working with Asian Americans is that so little of the resources and the knowledge has been dedicated to understanding these communities better. So, for example, from 2002 to 2018, only 0.17% of NIH funding went to projects focused on these communities. And we've already said these are about 6 or 7% of the population. So, there is a lack of good, empirically tested, thorough data and reading available to us as therapists. But what do we know? We do know that we're talking about, again, more than 6% of the population identifying as Asian American or Pacific Islander. And past studies have shown that nearly 15% of that community have reported having mental illness in the past year. So that alone would be more than 2.9 million people. And we all know that people tend to underreport in surveys. So we are talking at least minimum 2.9 million people. And this is a slightly older study. And given some of the stressors, it's likely much more than that now. So it's a significant group of people really who might benefit from clinical care. Historically, Asian Americans have been shown to receive the least clinical care. So in past studies, you'll see that Asian clients compared to other ethnic groups receive mental health services at a lower rate significantly. Past studies have also shown that when we do come to treatment, we tend to have waited longer, which means symptoms are more severe. There are some who say, well, I think these communities don't have as many mental health problems. And that's definitely not true. Global studies will show that Asian countries, just like all other countries, also have high rates of concerns about mental health diagnoses. That lots of people in surveys will say that either they themselves have been dealing with mental health challenges or know somebody who does. So this is very sort of across the board similar. Right? We know that major depression is one of the big health challenges facing countries worldwide. It's a myth that therapy and psychiatry are for Western people. The fact is that Asian cultures have practiced mental health care in different forms, and maybe without that title, for thousands of years. And I'll get back to that too, about ways that we have integrated some of those practiced into contemporary mental health treatment. Also, mental health stigma creates a barrier for Asian American clients. Now, we know that this is a barrier for all clients. False beliefs, social judgments, misinformation, negative attitudes about mental health, these all lead to shame, fear, discrimination, bullying. These all create a barrier to accessing care and support. This is magnified in Asian American communities where it is less likely to talk openly about mental health, and it is harder to find the right kind of care that is culturally responsive, maybe meets language needs. And ironically, even though a collectivist culture and mindset is more common among Asian Americans and generally seen as very protective, that Asian American clients tend to feel a part of a community, a family sticks together. However, that can be a real problem with stigma, where a family will collectively feel that, oh, if we admit that, say, my son needs mental health care, then we think that's something that brings shame or shows problems in our entire family. So it increases that mental health stigma load. And as we get toward talking about best practices, I hope you can think about the different ways that numerous ancient healing practices are already adapted for contemporary care. You might already engage in some of these yourself. It's super common now for the food as medicine movement or herbal treatments to be a part of balancing ourselves, for principles that have been talked about for thousands of years in, say, for example, Buddhist philosophy about acceptance, cognitive reframing, modulating the mind, practicing mindfulness, using deep breathing as grounding, utilizing movement, yoga or Tai Chi. These are all ways of balancing health and mental health that can fit neatly with Western training as well as Asian heritage practices. Best practices when you're working with an Asian American client: really be careful about your intergenerational assessment. Support positive ethnic racial identity. Incorporate cultural practices. Assess and then support values and address current systemic stressors. And we'll talk a bit more about ways to apply these concepts. Intergenerational assessment. Of course, you always assess for family of origin history. For Asian Americans, the family of origin assessments really should intentionally include intergenerational migration and heritage questions. It's really important to understand your Asian American family or client could be a fifth generation American, they might be third culture, they might be recent immigrants or recent refugees or descendants thereof. They could be adoptees or transracial adoptees. That one or two detail about understanding the intergenerational path might give you a lot of important information about where you want to focus your clinical attention. This will help you reveal areas for further inquiry or research. A vignette example: 50-year-old Vong was born in Texas to Lao refugee parents. Work stressors have mounted, and arguments with his teen son are stressing him out. He suffers nightmares and is drinking heavily. His wife demanded he enter counseling after an incident last week when he blanked out and broke furniture while screaming at their son. Vong is horrified. He reports memory gaps since childhood. He does recall his parents having scary, fugue-like episodes of violence. He thinks it was related to their refugee experiences, but the family has never spoken of this. Now, if we only treated Vong for his emotional modulation and worked with him on, say, cognitive reframing, we'd really be missing out on an important aspect of his own trauma and his parents' trauma and possibly his grandparents' trauma. To better understand what might have contributed to disassociation, tendencies for substance use or violence, it might be helpful for Vong to go further back in the assessment and to really address maybe grief and healing in an intergenerational and family-oriented way. Next is to think about ways that counseling can support positive ethnic racial identity. Now, we don't usually put something like positive ethnic racial identity on a treatment plan, that's not considered a medical thing, so to speak. However, numerous studies have shown that positive ethnic racial identity is correlated with protective health factors for mental health. It's been shown that those with a positive ERI have higher self esteem, and this is particularly relevant during youth identity development. They have lower depressive symptoms, they have a strong sense of self and group positive traits, and positive identity is associated with protection from adverse experiences. It's emotionally and mentally protective, less internalizing of external stressors. What could that mean? That could mean I experience a really negative put down or I experience a racist comment. But if I have a strong sense of positive I am not likely to internalize that in a way that makes me ruminate and feel bad for a long time. I can hold it as this is a crappy thing that happened and it's that person's problem, and I can move on in a more healthy way. So, thinking about ways to help a client really develop a strong sense of positive ethnic racial identity is actually very fundamentally protective. Next is to think about how might you incorporate cultural practices and do that in planning care with your client. In most Asian heritage cultures, as well as most people of the global majority cultures worldwide, mind and body and spirit are fundamentally connected. There's no Descartes mind body sort of problem. It's understood that one affects the other. So, treatments can be understood as holistic health balancing, especially with, say, elder Asian immigrant clients that I have who often have great stigma against mental health care and diagnoses, that they would be totally opposed to say, oh, I'm here to work on my major depression. But they understand and can relate to this idea of, oh, my health is out of balance. I should take care of that. And that can incorporate cultural practices. An example is in nearby Oakland, where I live. They had Qigong, which is a bodily practice, Qigong class for seniors, senior immigrants. And they would do mental health screenings and tips at the end of class. Now, if you had invited these people to come to the mental health screening class, they would never show. But because it was integrated as a part of a normal, understandable bodily practice, this completely made sense. So think about, and you can talk with your client about what are the opportunities for community, family, or spiritual involvement? Are there ways to work together that feel culturally congruent, acceptable as something that can be practiced? Ask your client what is personally meaningful for art, rituals, music, and practices that can be incorporated into a coping skills plan. For example, I've worked with a lot of clients who are dealing with grief, and there were many that felt a great deal of healing from engaging in culturally tailored rituals to help them express and process their grief. And so, what is it for their culture and community? Is it burning incense? Is it writing letters? Is it taking a day to do certain things that you can help someone customize how to mix cultural practices into their daily life now? For example, I work with a lot of students, and they may be very far from their home or their family or their home country, but we can develop things that help them to feel grounded and connected and feel healing even while they are away from home. Some examples to think about too. Um, I had the opportunity to visit the Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center. Absolutely fantastic. You can look them up. And although they are a modern, contemporary healthcare system that any of us would recognize, with primary, dental, and mental health care, and they have hospitals and they do field visits, they also have an herbal medicine garden and provide herbal medicine care. They also have traditional Hawaiian lomi lomi massage. They offer community care events. And they have a kapuna council, which means a council of elders who helps them to look over their services and make sure that they're culturally acceptable and familiar. Now, we can't all have a Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center in our neighborhood, but they offer a good model for thinking about what could we integrate into the regular sort of standard counseling that would be tailored for this client. Another good person to look up, especially if you're working with youth, is Dr. Joyce Chu, who's at Palo Alto University, that she has been working on cultural adaptations of evidence-based clinical interventions and cultural theory in suicide assessment and care. And this is hugely important to think about because some of what her lab has found is that a lot of the ways that we were trained to assess for suicide risk don't look the same in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander clients. So, are we actually missing warning signs because they are expressing them in a different way? And so, thinking about cultural adaptations and how to modify maybe what we've learned and thinking about it from a more culturally tailored lens. Next is really being explicit when you assess and support the values of your client. The number one complaint for decades that I hear from Asian American clients who are in therapy is that they experience a truly fundamental mismatch between the clinician and the client values that's at the root of the therapeutic rapport. And these cause misunderstandings and ruptures in therapeutic rapport. So, for example, you might consider using values worksheets as part of treatment goal setting and as you get to know someone. Now, with all populations, I've found that many have said they've never had the opportunity to really sit down and do values worksheets and really narrow down their primary values um, and really think about and talk about which ones are social, but which ones are mine personal and spiritual, and really root themselves in that. But if you are able to do that, it will help clarify throughout treatment, are we in alignment about our objectives and our values? Because even when we have really positive, healthy intent, we might have an impact that the client experiences as negative for their values. Like I'll give this example, this vignette, which is not uncommon. Donna is a 30-year-old Vietnamese Chinese woman who sought therapy due to insomnia and anxiety following escalating conflict with her in laws. Their lack of boundaries and criticisms of her have grown relentless now that her twins are in preschool. Her husband is often away for business reasons. Her therapist advised her to set strong boundaries and cut off her in laws so as to protect her health. Donna dropped out of treatment. Despite her distress, she could not fathom cutting her children off from their grandparents. And so this is a perfect example of the therapist has very good intent. We've got to protect Donna's health. However, the impact was that Donna feels that some of her really core family values are being utterly disregarded. And if the therapist and Donna had actually discussed this more openly, um, and taken some time to process, perhaps they could have figured out what are the compromises in the recommendations that could help Donna to set boundaries at a pace that works for her, and in a way that respects sort of the role of the grandparents, but also helps her to explore other ways of being. However, this kind of scenario happens a lot in treatment when the therapist makes a strong recommendation that is experienced as being against a core value. Another best practice is to make sure that you've done a little bit of preparation thinking about how to address current systemic stressors. Now, this is 2025, and I want to acknowledge that everybody is experiencing exhaustion after something like 5 or 6 years of what feels like relentless, unprecedented times and stressors. So, absolutely, there are many stressors now impacting everyone economically, politically, environmentally, and otherwise. However, historically marginalized people or isolated people are even more vulnerable to systemic stressors. So, if your Asian American client perhaps lives in a place that they feel very isolated, there's not much community, or they're already marginalized in some way, perhaps they're economically struggling, or they've experienced racist incidents, then they are even more impacted by the stress that everyone else is feeling. Now, and this is where gaining some awareness of relevant aspects of Asian American history can play a lot into how you understand current clinical presentation. Becoming familiar with specific resources and supports in your community or region is what I consider not just a feather in your cap, but a wonderful resource to have. We have all been that therapist who is scrambling to call friends or post on a listserv. Does anybody know anything about a resource for a certain client? But given with the growing body of work on Asian American mental health, you actually can prepare some of this in advance now so that you don't feel like you have to scramble when working with Asian Americans. You can become familiar with online or remote resources and supports, as well as maybe what is available in your region. Just one example is that in the past few years, there's been an escalation of hate and violence against Asian American Pacific Islander communities. And the Stop AAPI Hate group is a wonderful group with data as well as tips and support. But for example, they've documented in the research things like Asians who have experienced racism are more stressed by anti Asian hate than they were by the pandemic itself. And that those who've experienced racism display racial trauma, which is psychological and emotional harm. And that Asian Americans who have experienced racism have heightened symptoms of depression, anxiety, stress, and physical symptoms. So, this is something that you might see playing out in your community or with Asian American clients, depending on how safe they feel, where they live, how much support they have. And vignette to talk about this. 38-year-old Korean American James was referred to Employee Assistance Program by his boss due to impaired performance. James meets criteria for a major depressive episode, but he becomes impatient when the therapist recommends self-care and CBT reframing tips. He complains that this info is not going to make a dent in his main stressors. He is scared his kids will be bullied at school or his parents will get attacked. His mom was called a slur and followed the last time she was shopping at Walmart. He feels angry, helpless, and useless to protect them. So remember, this also touches back to when we talked about ethnic racial identity. These are really awful experiences for anybody to have. And depending on how you assess to James, he may or may not have the positive identity that helps protect him from internalizing all this negativity and helplessness. So, as a therapist, you can work with him on multiple levels. There are practical resources for safety, but also ways that he can not internalize the negativity of what's happening to him, as well as going back to the original therapist recommendations of how does he practice compassionate self-care and use CBT skills to cope with the very real stressors that are going on, but in a way that maybe won't impair his work performance as much or reduces the amount of rumination that these negative events are already taking up in his mind. In general, it's important to remember that a supportive, validating response is far more important than knowing all the facts. Even though I brought up a lot of tidbits about immigration history and refugee history and current events and Asian American identity, these are all fantastic things to understand. But even if you don't know much about it, being validating and culturally responsive and practicing cultural humility goes a long, long way. The willingness to grow and listen and be present is huge. I've definitely heard lots and lots of Asian American clients say that their therapist of a different background maybe doesn't get everything, but has been so helpful and supportive and has been able to co create with them a treatment plan and path that is helpful. Understanding when and how to refer to additional resources or refer out treatment completely is also important. So you shouldn't ever feel that you have to know all the things. And so I'm going to talk a lot about resources to keep at your fingertips. And also, it's okay to refer out if you feel that you are really unable to help a client. The good news is that research on ethnic racial matching, so matching the identity of the client and the therapist, all that research has not shown that ethnic matching is necessary or even always better. It really is about the relationship that you build. Some organizations that I recommend getting to know are listed here, and a lot of them have free information. So, for example, the Lotus Project has continuing education workshops and info available online. Guides, for example, I'm working with Asian American refugees. Asian Health Services has been around in Oakland for 50 years. Asian Mental Health Collective is an absolutely fantastic nonprofit with lots of free resources for you to learn more, but also even free resources for your clients. So if you live in an area, for example, that doesn't have any community support for Asian Americans, Asian Mental Health Collective regularly offers online support spaces that are free or very low of cost. RAMS is also a 50 plus year org that has lots of information, and NAPIMA is a national organization about Asian American Pacific Islander mental health. So lots of really good free info and experts that you can access as well as point your clients to. If you're working with parents, I recommend going online and looking up Cheap How. Stanford Cheap How, Community Health um, for Parenting, is a effort that came out of, unfortunately, a tragedy that you may have heard that we had many deaths by suicide of young people in the local area of Palo Alto near Stanford. So psychiatrists at the hospital created Cheap How as a model to help educate Asian parents, many of whom were immigrants, on how to talk with your adolescents about mental health. And this came about because parents gave feedback that everyone says I should talk to my kids, but I don't know how. So if you look at the Cheap How website, you'll see they do have recordings of little skits, for example, of they would act out. Here's a really bad way to respond to a kid with mental health concerns. And then they would rewind and say, here's a way to act or respond that can be better at facilitating connection. So Cheap How is also something that's free, and you can look at those recordings online. You're not expected to be an expert on psychiatry and Asian Pacific American, Desi Americans, but you might just want to know that if you want to read more, there are resources available from various places, but UCLA has been doing some great work examining that, even for example, that Asian Americans have different pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic profiles of medications. Your client might actually respond to treatment really significantly different for dosages and side effects than other clients. And this often results in medication compliance issues. So, for example, I often experience that the dosages that are given to other people are way, way, way too strong for me. And so often an Asian American client might just seem like their medication or treatment non-compliant, but it might be because it's not working well for them. It's not suitable. There's a whole field looking at ethnopsychopharmacology, far beyond our general daily work as therapists, but good to know and keep in mind. Genes and culture and environment might really impact the way that your client is responding to your care, as well as medication care if they're getting it. These days, you can refer clients to explore on YouTube. Now, unfortunately, we know that the quality of mental health information on places like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube are not reliable. But here's a few that I think can be really helpful for your own learning ongoing as a therapist, as well as places to refer clients to look at. Asian Mental Health Collective, which I've already mentioned, Yellow Chair Collective, Dr. Ramani Darasala, who's a specialist in narcissism, The Psych Show, Dr. Alima Tu, pictured here. Lots of different topics, but especially great for anxiety. The Asian American Psychological Association, Dr. Stacy Leadham, Dr. Kevin Nadal, who are Filipino American psychologists, Dr. Nellie Tran, who posts a lot, especially for first gen and low income students, Vietnamese American, childhood refugees, and Dr. Jeannie Celestial, also a Filipino American psychologist who does culturally integrated work. So these are all publicly available, reputable resources from licensed professionals who are Asian American. If you yourself are someone who likes to read a lot, or your client is, we really do have, in just the last few years alone, many more books available about Asian American mental health than we used to, and all are intergroup diversity. So these are just a few of the ones that I recommend. For clinicians, the clinical interventions for internalized oppression is really valuable at helping us to think about how do we recognize, assess, and support someone who may be dealing with internalized oppressions. Asian American Journal of Psychology is a professional journal, also for therapists. But we also do have layperson friendly books like the Racial Healing Handbook. I wrote the Healing Trauma Workbook for Asian Americans. There's Permission to Come Home. These are all books that are very accessible for your client to maybe look at on their own. I think my favorite um, stories of how people have used the Healing Trauma Workbook for Asian Americans is I had a therapist who's Chinese American and who bought a copy for herself and bought a copy for her white therapist, and she wanted them to talk about it together. I've also heard about someone who is using the workbook but adapting it for her own community of Korean Americans. So, really looking at the tools that do exist so you don't have to feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. Where I Belong is by Yellow Chair Collective co-directors, and it is also an extremely accessible book for lay people, and that could be used as therapy homework. There's also maybe story narratives that are less mental health focused, but actually are a great tool to talk about mental health themes. That often reading some of these books has been a guide for Asian American clients who have not had much opportunity to talk about mental health within their families of origin. Being able to look at and read about somebody else's narrative and story can be a huge tool. And I recommend often bibliotherapy, video therapy, movie therapy, as a tool for what clients can do to give themselves language, bring that into therapy, and also sometimes teach us as therapists about what resonates for them. I can't tell you the number of times that a client has come and said, "Hey, have you seen this Instagram? Have you seen this TV show? Have you read this book? This means a lot to me. I want to talk about it in session." So, again, lifelong learning and cultural humility sometimes can also be pretty fun as we're learning about new resources and information and entertainment and stories that can help us to do better work. And that's the gist of what I wanted to share about best practices when you work with Asian American clients. Thank you so much for listening and sitting in on this session. Share the knowledge that you've learned because we all have a role in improving the skills and decreasing the stigma in all of our communities. I'm at Hella Mental Health on Instagram and YouTube, and please do follow Agents of Change for more professional CE training opportunities.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.